I'm going to start the recording. The YouTube recording will just be there. Unfortunately, that means I'm going to just really quick message everyone who's not just to let them know, right, that and then we'll get started. That should do it. All right. So since we're just looking at the WebEx right now, this thing is always so slow. Let me just get into this and then we'll get going with the, there we go. So everyone should see a full screen, the Polyarchy. How's that gonna look? Okay. I don't know how well this is gonna go, all of it's gonna go, but let's just see. So, you should see me, you should see the Polyarchy. If that's not the case, let me know. We're only in WebEx right now. There aren't that many people here. So the first thing that I want to talk about is I did look at your exams. A lot of you were really nervous about them, but I saw a lot of work. Now, there was some confusion. There was still a lot of issues with understanding the material, but that's why I wanted this exam, why I didn't want to push it off, is because while there are some things that need to be answered, what's happening? Okay. I apologize. It's just that none of this is working the way that I want it to work. One second. So one of the thing about the exams, I really wanted you guys to talk about these issues. I wanted you to say what you understood, and I've looked through them. I haven't put grades to them yet because I really wanted to get a sense of the class. So I'm not just like grading the first one really harshly and then having to go back and regrade it. I wanted to give you the same level. I'm noticing you're understanding the material. You're sort of getting at the material very well. For most of you, you really put in an effort. I think we had 21 at 8 a.m. this morning. We had, I think, 21 of 26 people turning an exam. So there are some of you that didn't turn an exam. I think I have one student who hasn't turned in anything at all. So I think I have 3 or 4 that had emailed me about possibility. Look, the exam's not closed. Now, I might penalize you for a late. We'll talk about that later. But don't do it at all, right? If you turn it in late, I might consider that, but you have to turn the exam. It's too important to your grade not to turn it in for the people that are left. For those of you that did do it, right, I saw a lot of effort and a lot of progress. Next week, we're going to talk about the grades and why you got the grades, just because I haven't really gone through every single exam, and I really want to talk about things that were missed. Obviously, this is your first introduction. For most of this, your first introduction to a lot of the scientific methodology in this field. So there's a lot of issues that were sort of missed. And I want that to be an important aspect of this, that I understand that this is new, that this is very temperamental in the way that we're learning this, and all these factors matter in such a way that they're going to have a negative impact on your ability to to get through this material. So don't take anything that happens on the grade as like you're doing poorly in the course. I made the first part very challenging. But if you really understand the first part, the rest of it's going to be pretty easy. We're going to talk about regimes directly, right? I've read through Robert Dahl's article. and then through the Hagstrom article, right? If you understand the scientific aspects of it, the other parts are pretty simple, that they're easier to understand because of it, right? Especially when we get to Hagstrom, which we're actually not going to cover the last part. I want to have like fresh eyes and fresh minds when we go into that last part of Hagstrom's article, because it gets really scientific, but it's very important to understand why that matters so much. So the first part that I really want you to get at is, however you did on the exam, don't let that be an end-all. Don't let that be a concern, right? Because I'm going to work with you, and at every stage we're going to continue to do this. Now, I did get a couple emails over the last few days. They sort of, I'm getting bombarded with administrative emails. Some of you asked specific questions about the exam, and I just didn't have any sort of access to a time frame where we could meet up this week. That doesn't mean we can't meet up after this class. And when I go through your exam, if you feel like, okay, this was something wasn't very clear, then we'll talk about that as well next week. But for now, let's get into polyarchy. Let's get into what it means to be a democratic regime. And next week, if you have any questions about the exam, because the due date was this morning, right? Next week, we'll have a discussion about the exam, and you can ask any questions you want, and we'll sort of go over that. And I'll post a rubric as well. I'll explain, like, I'll post something that says this is what was necessary for a 5, this is a 4, like, this is what was necessary for a grade on any one given answer. And if one of the questions, answers one of the questions is clearly more people struggle with, then I'll take that into account. And I adjust grades as necessary, so no one should feel defeated if they didn't do as well as they wanted to. But if you didn't turn something in or you didn't answer the questions, go back and do all of it, right? Do the entire exam. I know it's a longer take-home. All right, so let's get into polyarchy. Robert Dahl starts writing in the 1980s about what it means to be a democratic regime. And one of the things that becomes very clear to Robert Dahl is that when we talk about democracy, it's not very clear. It's not very clear what we're talking about. We might be talking about just free people, or people have certain rights or civil liberties, but if we're going to find out, is a country a democracy, we need some characteristics, we need some criteria. And so he comes up with this term that had some older usages that he talks about, but that he sort of coins as these basic criteria, as this underlying condition. If you want to be a democracy, you're going to need these institutions that are really set up, these criteria that show that you have certain freedoms and ability to associate. Oh, okay. All right, so the first part is the historic shift. Now, until the 20th century, until about the 18th century, I should say, it was believed, and so strongly argued going into the 1850s and at the change of the 20th century, was this argument, started by Rousseau, that democracies really only exist at a city-state. And a city-state is small. It's a small organization. It's homogenous. All the people have the same beliefs and preferences, right? And the only way that a democracy can work is at the city-state level, because the institutions can be very clear, right? Every single person gets to speak about their political beliefs, and every single person gets to engage in their political beliefs, right? So if you start with this, one of the problems is, well, great, countries, states, they can't be city-states anymore. They can't be that small. One is that economic systems are growing, right? So we need a bigger economic system governed by a single state. So because of a growing international trade, because of growing industry, right, especially as we get into the beginning of the 20th century, we need some larger organization. The other part was that between the time that Rousseau's writing and as we go into the 1770s, right, this is the beginning of sort of the American system. In 1776, between 1776 and about 1820, there's this real transition where you see a very large government, even before you have the westward expansion of the United States, you have a very large government, and you start seeing that the scale needs to be the nation state, right? We see some of this in Germany, right, when it unifies in the 20th century. The United Kingdom and France, they sort of build up their nation state. They do it through conflict and sort of building up their defenses. But the new unit that we're going to be concerned with is the nation state. And if we want people to live with certain rights and freedoms, because we all want those, right? So we want it to live in a society which has those, right? Those are normative goods that we might want. Then we need to find a way to apply them to this nation-state scale, right? Now, when I talk about a nation-state, we talked about how Africa is different, but one of the things that matters here is that borders were often defined by national or ethnic groups. The United Kingdom is a little weird because it has so many different groups that are identifiable. But there is a sort of English nation, right? The American nation. The American nation is sort of this hodgepodge, but it comes together into certain values. The French nation is a little more homogeneous, right? The French have a shared culture, have a shared language. And what you see is these sort of naturally defined groups, right? Why is the French territory shaped the way it is? Because the Spanish people sort of have their own natural sort of national territory, right? And the difference between French and Spanish territories is very clear, right? And so you have these natural groups that sort of set their borders where there are groups in, where there are national or ethnic groups in. And then what you have in a nation state is you often have rivers or mountain ranges or some sort of geographic factor that acts as a natural barrier, right? This natural break, right? That on that side of the river or that side of the Mediterranean Sea is a very different group of people than on this side of the Mediterranean Sea. And it's just most obvious. The most obvious example among Americans is the European scale. But it's true in other places as well. It's just that in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of the Middle East, right, in sort of the Arabian Peninsula, right, that foreign powers had a lot to say in how borders were made, so they don't really match with groups. But the nation state still becomes this sort of natural unit of analysis. And so when we take this historic shift, there are a lot of differences that are going to occur. You can't have the same type of democracy in a city-state as you do in a nation-state. So one of the first consequences of this is representation. Now, we live in a state that has both. We sort of vote directly, direct democracy, and we have a legislative branch. Now, one of the things that happens when you have this change in scale, most obviously, is that you start to have indirect representation, right? A group of individuals, right, we all come together and we vote and we end up choosing one representative, right? Or two in the case of the United States, right? You can have 2 senators, or I think we have 6 representatives. We just had a census, so we'll probably see this year the number of representatives in the House change for Nevada, but I just don't have census numbers yet, right? They're still compiling. So instead of us all just meeting up, right, if you have a city-state, it's direct representation. You all meet up and you argue over what's going to happen, and then you come to some sort of agreement, and that's what the city-state does. With indirect representation, you might not like the person who got elected. You might not have as much representation. So Rousseau, right, and sort of the ancient democratic peoples, or sort of the Athenians and the Greeks, right, they wouldn't even consider us democratic. Because we don't have a direct say in what we want our government to be. But obviously it would be impossible for the 370 million or 350 million or however many people in the United States today to all come together. That's unrealistic for us to be productive in that large of a scale. Now, because we have representatives sort of handle political issues for us, and we elect them, right? Or we find someone appointed, right? Because we're not just talking about the United States, and many other countries appoint their representatives, right? You don't vote for them, they just get picked by elites. That also means we can have unlimited extension, right? We can have any size of democracy, right? The United States is the largest democracy. We have a ton of land mass, right? Huge territory, but also over 300 million people, right, that are citizens of the United States. right? So we have a large population and a large landmass. Now, compared to some other places, right, India's a democracy as well, and it has over 1 billion people. So the idea is you can have as large of a landmass and as large of a population as you want, and that's the benefit of this change in scale, right? Unlimited extension. The next part is there's obviously going to have to be limits on participation, right? If you can't interact directly, then there has to be some process to engaging in politics, right? Now, most of us would say the only way that we engage in politics is to vote, right? Voting is the only process. Now, there are other things you can do, activism, right? Join a political party, contribute funds, right? Campaign, right? There are things you can do, but for a lot of us, we'll never really be involved in a policy process. You're not going to actually write a bill, right? Some of you might actually do that. You might become lobbyists, or right, you might work in the Capitol and you might actually write bills. But that's going to be less than 1% of the population that's really engaged in that process, right? So for most of us, not going to be able to sort of directly interact or directly change the outcome of any of the politics that occur in a democracy. The next consequence is really big, and it's really important because it really has good and bad aspects, right? When you are diverse, and we say non-homogeneous or heterogeneous groups, right? So a homogeneous group, everyone's sort of the same, they share values, they share an ethnicity, a language, a race, right? Whatever makes them the same, right? They're one sort of group. When you have a larger democracy, when you have a larger scale of democracy, what you're going to end up with is heterogeneous groups or non-homogeneous groups. And so they're going to be different in a lot of ways, right? The most obvious is this local versus regional. Now, there is a difference. I grew up in California, and so I grew up in Northern California. And so there's a difference between Northern and Southern California. But I grew up in a small town outside of a big town, right? Like not a suburb, just a small town that was a few miles away from a much larger town. That large town was very different. It was very diverse, right? It was very sort of open. It was very industrial. And I come from a small sort of grape vineyard town, right? It's called Lodi. But it was all, when I was growing up, it was all grape vineyards. So there's this local difference between my small town, right, and the larger town that was right next to us. The same is true in places like when we talk about Henderson versus Vegas, right? That Henderson behaves slightly differently. When we take that to a larger perspective, a regional perspective, we see that there are major differences, right? Even though we are a democratic state now because we have democratic representatives, sort of from the Democratic Party. But our version of liberal is very different from California, right? Our beliefs are very different from California, right? There's no estate tax, or we don't have a special estate tax. We don't have a state income tax, right? There's an anti-taxation effort, right, in Nevada. But it's also extremely different from the East Coast and the southern states, right? There are certain things about southern states that never existed in Nevada, right? That are regional differences. So we have those differences that make us disagree on policy, right? We have no, right? Nevada doesn't talk about Confederate statues because we didn't have any Confederate statues. We never had Confederate statues. We never had any desire for Confederate statues. We weren't part, right? The state of Nevada becomes a state in 1864. So we weren't even in existence until as the Civil War ends. So the Civil War ends and then we become a state. There's no reason to talk about the Civil War or the Confederacy in our state, so it's not part of our history. We wouldn't even discuss it, whereas if you look at southern states, very concerned with that. If you look at the south of France versus the north of France, very different behaviors, right? One is a tourism economy. The south of France is a tourism economy. So it really wants open borders. It wants people to come in as easily as possible. The northern part of France is an industrial center, right? It's sort of closer to the other places in Europe. And so it might want to make sure that its local population has jobs. So you might have a much more xenophobic or a much more anti-immigration northern France than in southern France, who wants people to come in constantly, who wants that constant exchange of people. So those are regional differences. You can also have religious differences. Now, what we see when we have sort of religious differences or ideological differences is that the groups think the government should behave differently. This is when it really starts to become an issue of what should the government do, right? If you look at the differences in sort of other, I don't really want to use the United States for an example, but I know that, right? If you look at the differences of religious expectation in certain states, right, some of them expect there to be 10 commandments outside of courthouses, and some believe that's unconstitutional, right? So you have those different beliefs. If you look at places that are different between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, right, their idea of how a government should function is different, right? Especially if you compare Iran and Iraq, right? Iran thinks that a religious leader should be in charge, right? They have that religious leaders, the Ayatollahs, right? Khomeini, when he comes in 79 in the revolution, right? That Iran is like, embraces that religion should be part of the government, right? And so obviously the separation of religion and government only exists in certain places and certain ideologies. And when you have a larger scale democracy, that contention can really matter, right? Because what we believe can really be different. The next is occupational. We saw, in the beginning of the country, we saw a much more industrious northern colonies than the southern colonies. And so the northern colonies needed skilled labor more than they needed just people. And so they were always anti-slavery, right? Even though normatively we could talk about it, but obviously there's an occupational difference. If we look at West Coast and East Coast behavior, right, coal played a much larger part in the East Coast, right, because it does more to produce energy through the winter, right? That's when they need the most energy, especially we're talking about like 20th century America. So coal really does a lot to produce energy in the winter when other forms of energy, especially renewable energy like wind and solar, aren't actually as effective, right? There's more cloud cover, there's actually less wind. So in the East Coast, especially in the Southeast, right, that coal plays a larger role in the winter. Now, if we look at the Southwest, right, the winter, the energy requirements are actually quite low. It's cold, but it's not that cold, right? Whereas in the summer, it's very, very hot, but, right, when we look at the energy sources, solar and wind are much more functional in sort of a Southwest setting, right? Especially places like here in Arizona, where solar power produces a lot. So our occupational designs, the jobs that we have, they will call us to have different expectations, right? Nevada's a little more conservative than the states that neighbor it, but it's not opposing solar power because it's producing a lot of jobs here, right? So those can have, obviously have the impacts. And the last part that is part of the specific consequence is this ethnic and racial aspect. When you have a very small city-state, everyone's the same race and ethnicity. When you're talking about something as massive as the United States or India or China, they're not all the same ethnicity or race. And this is going to create a lot of problems because in a democracy, one of the things that you're always concerned about is the tyranny of the majority. And we'll actually talk about this later during today's lecture. The homogenous group, right, we talk about the United States, or if we talk about the UK, is sort of this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant sort of grouping that has the majority of the population. And so if we look at the laws, they clearly favored, right, the ethnic majority, right, for most of the history of either country. So right now I'm just pointing out all the negative aspects, right? That they're not going to be disagreement, right? That often someone's going to lose out, right? If you were a Catholic before John F. Kennedy, there was no way you could run for president because Americans had a disdain for Catholics as president because of their tie to the Pope, their divided loyalties, right? So each of those aspects caused some problems for a democracy because they couldn't come together. The benefit of diversity is as those groups come together, they have different belief systems and they have different preferences. And as they argue them out, they can point out flaws in each other's arguments much more easily, right? That if we look at the government today, while it's not incredibly effective at distributing resources, resource distribution is much more need-based today than it has ever been, right? People get resources based on need much more today than other times in the past, right? And now it's need-based regardless of ethnicity or religion, right? You don't have to be white or a Christian, a Protestant Christian, to get help from the government, right? And so diversity can have benefits where the government is forced to recognize smaller minority groups and their interests. Now, the next consequence, because we just talked about how diversity has all these different things, right, that you're going to have competition, right? You're going to have competition. Now, when competition produces compromise, that's actually a good thing, right? We want the political parties to fight until we get something that is acceptable to sort of both groups, or is acceptable to the people that were voted in, right? So right now, Democrats control the House and the Senate, right? Boris Johnson, right, he has control of the UK government. They're going to get what they want, right? Because the voters sort of push it in. But if they're not responsive to the needs of people who aren't in that sort of majority voters right now, then they won't stay in power, right? So they have to be responsive. They have to address the grievances of the people who didn't vote for them in order to stay in power. And so that competition can be very useful. When it's really problematic is when we get civil strife. Now, we had a very small incident. I don't want to minimize the incident, but we had one day in the United States where we had some people sort of resort to violence or resort to sort of aggressive behavior because they didn't like what was happening. But for the most part, if you look at democracies and in the United States, while there's a lot of arguments about what should happen and protests and there is other issues, for the most part, there isn't widespread civil strife. We're not going after each other violently. We're not really picking minorities or small ethnic groups and sort of targeting them in the way that we did in the past. So civil strife is this really problematic thing that can occur because of conflict, but it can be avoided if the competition is directed into a political arena. Okay. So we have all these consequences. So now that we know there are consequences for this, we have to set up a system where we can see specific criteria that point out some necessary, not sufficient, but necessary aspects of a polyarchy, right? And a polyarchy is a category below democracy, right? You have to at least be a polyarchy before you can be a democracy, right? These are necessary aspects. The first is universal suffrage, right? So the part about universal suffrage is that everyone should have the right to vote and everyone should have the right to run for public office. Now, the thing about this is that women don't really get included in this category until about the 1930s, right? So if you were to look at data, it would say in 1890 that the United States had universal suffrage. Well, that's obviously not true, right? So the standards sort of change over time for what it is to be a polyarchy, right? The other part is to run for public office. Now, this has a lot of problems. Obviously, if you get arrested on a felony, you can't run for public office, but criminals have always had a different relationship, right? We know that if you're charged with a felony, often you could lose your voting rights. The other part is, right, so that excludes a very small percentage of the population. For the most part, it excludes a small percentage of the population. The other part is, yeah, sure, you could say that you're running for office, but does everyone have the resources to run for office? Can anyone really run for office, or is it going to cost you $10 million? And if you can't raise $10 million, you can't even try to run for office. So that's one of the things about universal suffrage and sort of universal ability to run for office is it's not just about do you have the right to, but do you have the ability to, right? Universal suffrage is great if I say everyone has the right to vote, but if we put into place something that doesn't allow them to vote for whatever reason, right? If there's only one polling place and it's 100 miles away, right? Like we saw during the Jim Crow era, right? Then, right? Especially during a time when many people didn't drive, right? Then those people don't have a realistic access to voting, right? And so universal suffrage is damaged. The next necessary criteria is free and fairly conducted elections for all adults. We sort of redefined adult a few times in the United States, but for the most part, we sort of defined sort of this 18 plus. 18 sort of become a standard for a lot of places. The United States actually has a few higher ages for different things, right? California now requires you to be 21 to smoke cigarettes. And now that marijuana is becoming legalized, not just here, but in other countries, it's creating this whole layer of when are you old enough, right? But for the election aspect of this, right, all we're looking for is could people go and vote, and they weren't being harassed on their way to the voting booths, right? They won't be encouraged not to vote, right? This has always been a concern. You might have seen this most recent election that there were people that sort of represented organizations, free and fair election organizations, just monitoring whenever someone was sort of coercive, right, or trying to stop people from voting, right? So we want to make sure there's no evidence of coercion, and there really wasn't, right? There's always some tension when people are lined up to vote, right? When you have the pandemic, of course, you'll have that. But there wasn't, right? We don't see a lot of coercion in free and fair elections, right? If you are part of a government that's trying to coerce people to vote, you try to hide it the best you can. The more likely aspect of this is vote buying. And vote buying is not incentives, right? You might vote for a Republican because you want to pay less in taxes. That's incentivizing. That's perfectly acceptable, right? If you say, I'm going to vote for this person because it's going to benefit me, that's just your vote and the way that you want to vote, and it's self-interested. And self-interested vote is perfectly acceptable. Vote buying is a direct relationship where someone says, vote for me, and I'll give you $10 right now if you go in and vote for me, right? That's vote buying, right? That's cash bought votes, right? Now, you might have a little more convoluted aspects where you say, well, if you vote for me and I get elected, I'm going to give you a certain amount of jobs, or I'm going to give you a certain amount of money, right? But vote buying is you vote for me and I will give you something tangible. I will give you something of value, right? And that means you're not voting based on your preferences or your principles, but your vote is being bought. And those are the two concerns that are already assessed. So you can't have coercion and you can't have vote buying for a free and fair election, right? And it's so obvious when an election is not free or fair, right? It's so clear when there's a violation of this that, right? Like there was no evidence of it in the last election because it's so easy to find evidence of inappropriate behavior, right? One of the things about free and fair elections is that they should be observed, right? You have observers. You have lots of people looking at it from both parties, from the bureaucracy. Everyone's looking at it, trying to find something wrong, right? When you have that many observers, it's very difficult for anyone to try and coerce or to try and vote by, right? The irregularities are incredibly uncommon when you have that much observation. The next is free speech and the protection to exercise it. So most countries that call themselves democracies have a right to free speech, right? The Soviet Union had a right to free speech. But if you actually spoke out against the government, right, they would arrest you. So there has to be free speech and there has to be this protection to exercise it. You have to have a right to say the things that you want to say and not be arrested. Now, one of the things that we get confused with today, there's a terminology that people are throwing around. It's actually deeply flawed terminology, but this idea of cancel culture. And I want to make this distinction because it happens in our society. People say, oh, my free speech is being violated. Cancel culture is actually a term that isn't scientific, but is connected to an older term by Schatzsnyder in a book called Semi-Sovereign People, where he called social sanctioning. And social sanctioning is where the society at large punishes you for something you've done, usually for free riding, for not doing your part. Free riding is where you don't contribute to a good, but you use that good. Like if you were mad about the election, but you didn't vote, or you ride a bus, but you didn't pay the fare, that's free riding, right? Free riding is this issue. So if you are socially sanctioned, that's not a violation of your free speech, right? If you go out and you use your social media to complain about the government will do nothing because you have protected free speech. In a lot of countries, protection of free speech. You have a right to say it, and the government can't come in and do anything about it. The difference is if you work for a company, right, and we've seen a lot of this lately, and you say something about anything, even about the government, that company has the right to sort of fire you. That's social sanctioning, right? That's society or the company firing you. That's not a violation of your free speech. And those are differences, right? We want to make sure that's clear, right? When we're talking about a democracy, the government cannot punish you if you say negative things about the government or if you say negative things about any aspect of life, right? You have the right to say negative things or to speak your mind. But that's different from social sanctioning, right? Social sanctioning can occur for any reason, right? And historically, it's occurred for very awful reasons, right? That there are still a number of states in the United States right now who can fire people for being gay, right? That's social sanctioning that exists right now, right? They are allowed to fire their employees for being gay, right? And that's within that governmental law, right? So that is in existence, right? If they spoke out about that, if they spoke out about gay rights, right, they could be fired from their job, right? So we still have an issue where social sanctioning can sort of punish people for speaking or believing different things than what is commonly believed, right? But we want to make sure that that's different from free speech, right? That we understand it's different from free speech. You can say what you want, and the government is not going to censor you unless you say specific things, right? You can't say that you're going to harm the president. You can't, do certain things that put people in danger. No one's in a crowded theater right now, right? But sort of that idea that you can't just panic people in a crowded theater, those aspects, right? But that's free speech. That is not being violated in any sense or form, right? What we see today, where people are sort of convoluting this, is they're saying, well, I lost my job, or, I got kicked off Twitter for 24 hours for saying this, right? Twitter's a company. They don't have to allow you to use their product, right? So it's very different. That's not a violation of free speech. The next part is free access to alternative information. Now, one of the things about Russia is that the major news channel is the Russia state-owned network, right? They own and control the network that is publishing most of this material. So when you see the news come on, or when you have information from the Russian state-controlled news, right, that is going to be influenced by what the Russian state wants its people to hear, right? In a more extreme example, the only access to information that North Koreans have is from the government. And so they are convinced, right, they are convinced their entire lives to believe things about their leaders, the North Korean people. Right? They are constantly bombarded with information from their government that tells them their leaders are immortal and they're doing everything to save them, right? And sort of trying to convince the population that they should follow their God, right? This is sort of the same thing as monarchs in the 17th century, going up until the 17th century, leading into the 18th and 19th century, we have a transitional phase. But if you don't have alternative information sources, then you can only get what's from the government, and you can be convinced of things that are simply not true, right? And while we are always concerned about false information, right? There's always a concern that the information you're getting is false. The most important part of a democracy is that the government doesn't control the information sources that exist, right? There has to be multiple information sources. They have to have free reign to sort of publish what they want. Now, I hate the term fake news. It's very problematic because you can claim anything as fake news. But the important part here is that even if it's not completely true, you have the choice to choose what sources of information you go after, right? And there are some that are like, they used to be called the penny press. I don't even know what they're called, like the National Enquirer, and they say like there's a Bat Boy and there's underground people, and those all exist, and they have a legal right to produce information, even if it's deeply flawed, because you, as a democratic society, right, have a right to access to alternative information. And that access to alternative information can be very beneficial as well, right? I'm sort of pointing out the negatives, right? But it can be very beneficial as well. You might get some information that's deeply flawed, right? You need to engage in critical thinking. The reason why you're being forced to take this class, if you're an engineering major, is because we know that you're going to be given a lot of misinformation as an adult, right? As you become, right, a professional, there's a lot of misinformation, there's going to be a lot of propaganda in any field that you are presented, and so part of this is engaging in critical thinking so you can tell the difference, right? Because engineering is very focused, right, or nursing is very focused on just the job, right? There are going to be other times where you need to do critical analysis, and if you understand the value of different sources of information, and you can tell whether or not something has validity, right? We talked a lot about internal versus external validity. If something has validity or if it's not logically consistent. And one of the things that I really hope you get from this course is when you hear someone trying to explain an argument, you can say, that doesn't make sense. And you can sort of do a deeper analysis and approach it scientifically and sort of make up your own mind about the validity of the arguments that are being made, right? Rather than just sort of accepting them at face value or accepting something that doesn't really have great logical arguments, right? That is a benefit of the humanities that you're forced upon when you get a college degree. Okay. The next part is a right to form and join autonomous organizations. Now, when we talk about an autonomous organization, sometimes they are involved in the government. When we talk about political parties, your right to form a political party and to join a political party, the government can't stop you. If you're truly a polyarchy, if you're a true democracy, the government should allow you to join political parties. But if those political parties are in the government, then you run into this problem of what does that mean when you join that party, right? That it has some impact. The other part is there are some autonomous organizations that really change society. And labor unions were one of these in the 20th century. You have a lot of people who are working in industrial jobs. They're not necessarily safe. They're not getting good wages, right? They're working 6-7 days, 10 hours a day, right? There's just not a lot going on, right? And then you have this labor movement, right? That's why you have a Labor Party in the UK, and that's why you have a Labor Party a few other places, not always called the Labor Party, right? But that sort of say we have to readdress what is important to us, right? What's important to the laborers? We need safer conditions. We need to work a 40-hour week because that's healthy, right? That anything more than that starts to damage our physical health, right? It degrades us down physically and psychologically. So the labor unions really have an impact on democracy because they change the discussion when it comes to working life, right? Political parties deal with policy, they're dealing with laws. Labor unions and other types of associations say, this part of society isn't working for us, and we can organize in such a way that we're going to demand some sort of change, right? Labor unions demand a change. They demand a 40-hour work week in the 20th century. The difference between this and something that doesn't fit this criteria, we can talk about sort of farmers' unions, right? The government came in and busts up the farmers' unions and sort of suppressed the wages of farmers for a time because they don't want that increase, right? That's a violation of this criteria. And so you don't see the farmers' unions really come into power until later in the 20th century. And that damages the democracy, right? Those groups couldn't come together in a way that was beneficial to their interests, right? And so this is a very important part of a polyarchy, is can you form and join autonomous organizations, right? Will the government stop you? Will the government monitor you? Will the government try to damage that organization in some way? And the less autonomous the organizations can be, the less democratic that system is, right? Because you have to have some sort of autonomous private life. The next part is responsiveness from the government to the voters. Now, we talked about this process of social revolution, right? The first thing that you do when you're unhappy with the government, everyone has grievances, right? It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone has something they don't like, right? Is this redress of grievances. You go to the government and you say, I don't like this. Now, you may not actually go, right? Here's one of those things that you don't always have to completely state your opinion. In 2016, I want to say, or 2018, it must have been 2018, the Republican senator from Nevada did something. He voted against the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, or what is commonly referred to as Obamacare, and he was voted out, and he was replaced by a Democrat. Now, what had happened is Nevadans made it very clear that while we are a more libertarian state, we benefit greatly from the Affordable Care Act, and we wanted it. We wanted to keep it. That individual voted against it. He was voted out of office, right? That's responsiveness through elections, right? That's an election, that's accountability. But that individual, the individual who did not get reelected, failed to redress the grievances of the population and didn't recognize that so much of the population had that grievance with the individual. The other part is that if you do ask for a change, that at some point you can get a different policy, right? There has to be some effective change, right? It's not just that the government will listen to you, but that after they listen to you, there can be some changes to the law that benefit your group and your grievances that you have. And we've seen this more and more throughout the history of democracies, right? Now it's actually quite easy to get a redress of grievances. We have a procedure in most places. The United Kingdom has a procedure, the United States has a procedure, France has a procedure, right? That most democracies have a very clear procedure. You go to a courthouse, you say, this government policy is negatively impacting me or violating my rights, right? I don't think it should exist, or I think it should have to be modified, right? Or it's unconstitutional if you want to go through the constitutional route, right? Or, right, it negatively impacts a certain group of people. So you can go to the courthouse, you can go to your elected officials in the legislative bodies. There's a very clear process for redress of grievances in governments that are established, democracies that are established. And the last part is accountability of government, right? Now, I want to say his name is Dean Heller, but I always get his name messed up, was the Republican senator for Nevada. Did not redress the grievances, didn't recognize the grievances of his population, of his electorate. The voters come in and they remove him from office. That's accountability of government, right? That last step is, okay, if this government isn't working for us, these elected officials, right? A government is a body of elected officials. If they're not doing what we want them to do, or they're not responding to our issues, then we're going to remove them until we get the people in place that we want, right? And because everyone's a little unhappy, what you should see is a rotation, right? Typically, you should see a rotation. One of the things that makes it clear that the United States is a very strong and stable democracy is that we've rotated power a lot, right? If you think about it, except for George Herbert Walker Bush being elected after Reagan, it's almost been a one-to-one, right? You have Bush Sr., and then you have Clinton as a Democrat, and then you have Bush Jr. as a Republican president, and then you have Obama as a Democratic president, and then you have Trump as a Republican president, and then Biden as a Democratic president. We have had, over the last 40 years, a lot of transitions of power. If you're not in power now, right, that your party can be in power later, right? 4 years ago, the Republicans controlled the House and the Senate, right? And now, Democrats control the House, and there's a 50-50 tie in the Senate, right? Which effectively gives the Democrats control because of the tiebreaker vote. But the important part is that there's been transition of power because the voters can force accountability on the government officials, right? If you're in office and you don't do what the public wants, you can be replaced. And that's a very important part of a polyarchy, which is the underpinnings of a democracy. Okay. So now that we've talked about these 7 criteria, why am I discussing polyarchy and not democracy, right? The first is that we have to understand there are certain ways to talk about a polyarchy. Now, a polyarchy can be a regime type, right? And what matters to us right now is we're getting into regime types. This quarter of the semester is going to be about regime types. We're going to do democratic regimes, we're going to do authoritarian regimes, and we're going to do hybrid regimes. One of the things about a polyarchy as a regime type is it gives us a democratic regime type with very clear aspects, right? A democracy is this big term that can mean so many things. A polyarchy, when treated as a regime type, can mean something very specific. It can mean those 7 criteria. So you say, okay, is this a polyarchy? Does it meet all 7 of those criteria? That's really easy to check, right? You can go one by one, and if it doesn't meet all 7 of those criteria, if there's not free speech, if there's not autonomous organizations, you can't join them, then it's just not a polyarchy. It doesn't match the criteria, which means it's not a democracy, right? So if it doesn't meet this basic requirement, or this procedurally minimal requirement, then it's not going to meet the larger requirement of a democracy. The other part about a polyarchy as regime type is you have really high tolerance for opposition, right? One of the things that we will see in an authoritarian regime is that opposition parties might exist, but they're not allowed to organize, they're not allowed to have a lot of funding, right? Often if they start doing better in elections, they get arrested, right? Polyarchies as a regime type really allow a lot of opposition. And if you're in control of the government, right, in the same way if we look at, in 2018, the Democrats took over the House, right? The Republicans weren't happy about that, but they didn't stop that process from occurring, right? House Republicans and stuff. They said, okay, well, we lost this election, right? Because we have a high tolerance for opposition, we're going to work with the people that are in the House that have come in, and as the Democrats are in charge, and we're going to try and win back enough seats to take back to power, right? We're going to do this politically. In a polyarchy, you have widespread opportunities to participate, right? If we consider the US as a model, the UK as a model, you can go to your next, well, you can't now. This is a very unique situation because you really can't get to your elected officials, but you can write a letter to your senators and your governor. You can start a campaign, right? That you can start a campaign or a petition, right? You can vote, you can fundraise, right? There's so many ways for you to participate, and as long as those don't violate any other existing laws, the government is not going to stop you from participating, right? If you wanted to go and protest, one of the things that's really weird about a democracy is if you wanted to go and protest, you're really unhappy, right? It could be, right, some of the bigger issues that are here, like police brutality, it could be immigration reform, right? It could be the mask mandate. If you wanted to protest, one of the things that you could do is go to the government offices that are appropriate government offices, and you could file a permit to protest on a certain day on a certain street. And what the government would do is it would block off that street. As long as there wasn't some sort of traffic issue, it would find some way to provide you with an opportunity to march. It would provide you with a pathway. Police officers would come out to make sure you were safe while you were protesting, even if you were protesting the police, right? The government has to provide you with the opportunity to protest, right, in a democracy. So if you filed the permit, and I'm sure there's a cost for a permit to protest, right, or to march, right, and then they would provide certain aspects of it, right? They would block it off. They would provide security. They would make sure that counter-protesters didn't harm you. And that's one of the things about a democracy is the opportunities to participate. They're not just allowed, they're protected by the government. The government is protecting your right to protest, even if you're protesting the government, right? So democracy really fits into that regime, and polyarchy as a regime type has to have these opportunities to participate. The third part is removal of incumbents through peaceful means, right? As we move forward, one of the things that we'll notice is that even when something starts to look like a democracy, what will happen is the individual in power will make it impossible to be removed through peaceful means, right? President Xi, the president of China, I don't want to mess up his name, but the president of China has effectively made himself president for life. There's not going to be another election to see who else is president, right? There wasn't really an election in the first place. There is no sort of movement within the elites to suggest that someone else would take power. So there's no longer really a peaceful means to do so, right? Now, there might be protests and eventually sort of a change in government or a movement towards a more democratic government. But right now, clearly China is not a polyarchy and is not a democracy because it fails some of these characteristics of a regime type. It doesn't have you don't have a right to free speech in China, right? That you can be punished for speaking your mind about the government, right? That there's a lot of censorship, right? But also that there's no way to elect someone to replace the president that exists, right? There's no peaceful means to remove incumbents. Now, as much as we want to think about regime types, there are other ways to talk about a polyarchy that will be useful to us as we move through the course. The first one is as a product of democratization. So what we see is this historically sort of limited amount of democracy. That there weren't a lot of democracies moving up until the 1800s, right? That they're very few and far between. They're very small states. They're not large nation states like today. And then we start to see one of the biggest, right, sort of territories, the United States, to become a democracy or to try and democratize. And what happens is, right, as Dahl points out, it just won't work as a city-state, right? It's too large to have everyone meet up, right? You need representatives, you need things. And so polyarchy explains that when a nation state, a large territory, wants to liberalize, wants to provide rights to its people, one of the aspects is that it has to change the way that it behaves, and polyarchy is a product of that. Not that we choose polyarchy, but if we're saying, okay, I want to be a democratic state, how do I do that? Polyarchy is the process by which it becomes a democratic state. These are the byproducts, right? That I want to have free and fair elections so that I can make sure that every vote counts, right? Everyone has a right to vote and to participate, and all of those things start to come into play, and it's a product of this larger scale transition. And so we might want to see it as a regime type, but we might also see it as a process of democratization that applies to modern nation states, right? Because not in 1776, because we don't really get into like the 1780s, it was just the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But in the beginning of the 1800s, leading up to the 1850s, the American Constitution really changes what is possible. And so there has to be a process by which this is occurring. And so that's the next interpretation, right? What is the process? Now, if we look back at the 7 criteria, one of the things that we'll notice is we go through a process where, okay, we don't have quite universal suffrage, but suffrage gets continually better. We don't allow organizations, but we see organizations to be autonomous more and more so. That if we're going through a democratic process, one of the ways that we become more and more democratic is to start slowly adopting the criteria and institutions of polyarchy, right? Each one is required, right? If we're going to become a democracy, we're required to include all 7. The other part is that we should understand that polyarchy is not sufficient. It's not enough just to have those 7 things, right? We need to have something else, and we'll talk about this after we get to the interpretations. The next part, interpretation, is a system of control by competition. So what matters here is that we have to have competition of political elites, right? That we have to have groups that are trying to win elections. And if we have a polyarchy, one of the things that polyarchy does is it starts pushing the people in office to move towards the majority of people, because if their preferences align with the majority of people in their electorate, then they'll win. And so polyarchy is a system of controlling the elites so that they match the interests of the people, right? This is one of those things that really matters for a polyarchy, is we should expect, if you have a polyarchy, if you have all 7 criteria, it will force the behavior of the political elites to start to blend with the preferences of the masses, right? We talked about social revolution, right? If you have a really strong incentive for the elites to want to represent the same values as the public, then there's no way to have a revolution, because every time that the public or the masses want something different, they just say, we want something different, and the elites just give them the thing that they want. Right? We saw this quite a bit, actually, in almost all democracies, right? And there is a fear of tyranny of the majority, right? That the majority wants something, and so they strip away rights of others, right? There are negative aspects to this, but what matters is that elites aren't just running the government and not responsive to the people. Polyarchy incentivizes those individuals, right? Rather than just saying they should, or this normative aspect, political elites should represent the people, now there is a reason why they would want to represent the people, because it helps them out in winning elections. There's a book called Congress, the Electoral Connection, and it points out that people, elected officials, they want to stay in office after they've been elected. So what they will often do is change their preferences to match the electorate that will help them win. So you might see a Republican become more moderate, or a liberal become more extreme, if their electorate becomes more extreme, right? If you live in southern Nevada, it's become much more democratic. So if you were a moderate Democrat, you might become a more progressive Democrat in order to stay in office, right? Because you want to represent the whole people. And then the last part to perceive a polyarchy is a system of rights, right? If you notice in the 7 criteria, there were a lot of things that needed to be protected, right? If free speech and freedom of organization are things that are part of a polyarchy, then they can't just be listed, right? That's the Soviet Union model. Yes, you have those rights, but you can be arrested for using them, right? That you have to have a legal right to speak freely. And if someone violates your legal right to speak freely, which is why I want to differentiate between free speech and social sanctioning, is because if someone violates your free speech rights, right, then you can go to the courts and demand, right, some redress of grievances. You can go to the courts and say, my rights were violated, and there needs to be action on this, right? And the courts will decide an appropriate response to that demand. Okay. So now let's talk about pluralism. Hold on. Okay. So pluralism, give me 1 second. Pluralism is this idea about competition over, it's very redundant. When we're talking about pluralism, we're talking about competition over ideas, policies, and politics, right? We're just talking about competition. Now, pluralism is where you have two groups and they're going to compete over what policy is going to be adopted. The benefits of pluralism is that if you have a bunch of people competing for ideas, at some point they're going to make adjustments. You might have some more moderation, you might have compromise, right? There are benefits to pluralism because you can really, through the competition over ideas, you can come up with better ideas, right? You can point out each other's flaws. Now, when you have pluralism, you're going to need to organize, right? If you believe something different from what I believe, and you believe the government should behave differently, right? If we look at what's happening right now, if you think that businesses should be open, or if you think that, pay should be increased for people, right? Hazard pay should be applied to anyone who's considered an essential worker, right? And let's say I'm not, but let's say that I'm a fiscal conservative and I think the minimum wage should be lowered right now to help businesses out, right? We're not connecting in what we think the new policy should be, right? To help the public, right? We disagree on policy. And if we both want something to happen, we're going to get organized. I'm getting organized with the Republican Party, you're going to get organized with the Liberal Party or the Democratic Party, right? We're going to form interest groups, right? I'm going to work with small businesses, you're going to work with labor unions, we're going to get organized, we're going to start competing through our organizations, and because of those organizations competing, we're going to have certain amounts of liberty, right? Labor unions will stop, right? Small businesses aren't really at odds with labor unions, but right, fiscal conservatives won't be able to decrease the minimum wage because of labor organizations, right? So this organization limits mob rule, right? It limits one group from running over the other groups, right? Because even if they don't win, one of the things about democracy is you may not be able to win every fight, but what you can do is limit the damage your group takes by losing, right? Right? Labor unions can say, we're going to stop you at every turn if you try to enact this policy, unless you add some provision to the policy that helps labor unions, right? And that liberty of organization keeps the mob rule from sort of taking over. And just to be clear, tyranny of the majority means mob rule, right? These are sort of synonyms. Tyranny of the majority is just when the majority, right, often sort of in a lot of democracies, or the white Christian majority, do something that takes away rights from other groups or that damages another group to the benefit of the majority, right, in a way that's sort of detrimental. So tyranny of the majority is sort of this older term where Schumpeter sort of this author named Schumpeter argued, where if I get 100 people in the room and I get 51 of them to say we should sort of take away the wallets of the other 49, right, then we, as a majority, have agreed and we're going to take from you, right? That's tyranny of the majority. That's the concern about a democracy, is if everyone's involved in the political process, then some majority is going to take away from a minority group. And organization and pluralism is what prevents that from happening. Okay, I need water. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. I think I have to end this, so we're going to have to jump into the next WebEx chat after this. I am going to sort of post this recording. I'm going to see how long it takes to post. But there will be recordings in case anyone needs to go back, or right. But if I can't get the YouTube to go, we're just going to have to drop it, and we're just going to do all WebEx, because I think I can record that as well, and I'll put out messaging once we get to the next stage. All right, so I'm gonna let you go.